Nintendo fans are some of the most passionate fans in all of gaming, which is understandable seeing as how, despite the asinine business decisions the company makes from time to time, they're responsible for some of the greatest games ever made. But sometimes fans get so passionate about highly anticipated games that they won't look at its flaws, or due to some weird principle, stigma, or consensus, they won't give other games an honest chance until people forgot why they weren't supposed to like them in the first place later on. So sit back, relax, call the number on the screen if you have any knowledge of the whereabouts of my father, press the subscribe button if you haven't already, and allow me, the 47th greatest man of all time, Cameron, to tell you 10 different times Nintendo fans changed their minds. Number 10. GoldenEye. Probably the most obvious game on this list, GoldenEye revolutionized first-person shooters on home consoles and was the third most successful game on the Nintendo 64, selling more copies than Super Smash Bros. And Elmo's Number Journey combined. With the exception of this dumbass kid named Gregory Kremzar, anybody who had a 64 played the hell out of this game, which paved the way for games like Call of Duty and all the shooters in the modern era. However, even the most mediocre modern shooters blow GoldenEye out of the water by adding features such as decent controls and multiplayer that wasn't shoehorned in the last 5 minutes of development. Not to mention that once you've gotten a taste of online multiplayer, it's kinda hard to go back to split screens that rely on the honor system. The first few people to suggest that GoldenEye doesn't hold up very well were needlessly sacrificed in the name of Lord Cromdar, with the exception of the aforementioned Greg Kremzar who had it coming. But after that, it's pretty much became universally accepted that while we all enjoyed GoldenEye back in the day, nobody wants to play it for longer than 5 minutes anymore. And even though I hardly play first-person shooters myself anymore, I definitely never feel the urge to go back and play GoldenEye cause it just can't hold a candle to first-person shooters in the modern day. Number 9. Luigi's Mansion. When the GameCube first came out, everybody shit all over it for daring not to have a traditional Mario game at launch. Which, to be fair, was humanly reasonable for people to expect that, seeing as how, with the exception of the Virtual Boy, this is the first time Nintendo's ever failed to deliver Mario at launch. And unfortunately for Luigi's Mansion, labeling it as a Mario game didn't do it any favors. However, just because you're disappointed at the lack of Mario doesn't mean you should take it out on a perfectly good game like Luigi's Mansion. If you're researching this game now, you might be confused as to what I'm talking about since the game got generally positive reviews and it even sold better than Mario 64 in its first month. But if you were around back then all you heard were bad things about this game from the average person who didn't even give it a chance. Sadly, due to the protests of these butt wagons, I didn't get around to this initially, but playing it since made me wish I had back in the day, and most of the people who bare-ass spray farted all the propaganda about the game are the same people who are always clogging up the arcade at Dave & Buster's and are also ecstatic about Luigi's Mansion 3. I think if Luigi's Mansion came out after Mario Sunshine, then people would have been way more open-minded about it. But speaking of Super Mario Sunshine, number 8. Well, obviously Super Mario Sunshine, you dingus. Once the GameCube finally did get its traditional Mario game, many people absolutely despised that it wasn't exactly the same as Mario 64, which caused many riots around the world, leading to the infamous clam shortage of 2002. Much like Luigi's Mansion, Super Mario Sunshine still sold well despite people's initial complaints. However, unlike Luigi's Mansion, while many fans who actually played Super Mario Sunshine did in fact enjoy it, there were still a lot of people left disappointed due to Flood's involvement and, the series trying something different. But fast forward years later, and what's everybody wanting an HD remaster on the Switch more than anything else? That's right, Daikatana, with Super Mario Sunshine being a close second. Now that time's passed, people can finally look at Super Mario Sunshine for what it is, rather than it not being Super Mario 64 2. But had Sunshine just been Mario 64 with more content, then people would have complained about it being more the same. And if you ask my goofy ass, I prefer Sunshine over 64 any day of the week, just for the camera alone. Either way though, it's better late than never for this game to get the universal love it deserves. Number 7. Super Paper Mario. When this game first came out, everybody loved it. Sure, it was a lot different from the Thousand Year Door, which is considered the best in the series by pretty much everybody, but most fans welcomed it at the time for being different, probably because they thought the changes would only be for one game. Then after Sticker Star for the 3DS, fans started getting antsy, and then Color Splash was the final straw that triggered Paper Mario fans to bury anything that's not like the first 2 games in the series, which are better if I'm being honest. And I understand fans rebelling against the series to get what they want, since supporting it will only result in it to continue to go in another direction, but it's still unfortunate that these 3 Paper Mario games have to be collateral damage as a result, because they're all fantastic and had a lot of heart and soul put into them. And even though people did initially like Super Paper Mario, it unfortunately gets the blame for being the game where everything went wrong. However, I think after we get a classic Paper Mario RPG, which I'd bet Nintendo's making since they clearly heard everybody's opinions at this point, people will change their minds and enjoy Super Paper Mario for what it is once again. And on a side note, I hope Color Splash finally gets the love it never had in the first place, because even though it's not better than the Thousand Year Door, and it does have its flaws, it's still a good game, damn it. So even if you don't tell anybody, give it a chance if you haven't already, because I guarantee you're gonna have a good time. Numbers 6 through 2. That's right, I'm doing 5 games all at once, and they're all from the Legend of Zelda series, because fans can't ever make up their minds. Which games are they? No, not Zelda 2, people have always had mixed feelings on that. But rather, let's start with Ocarina of Time, a game that for a while many people thought was the greatest game of all time. That is until Egoraptor made a video pointing out its flaws, which gave others the courage to speak out against the game as well, which is fine, and I have no problem with people being truthful about the flaws of classic games. But now we're at a point where some people just like to say the game sucks because it makes them feel special, which I think's going a little too far. And trust me, I'll duke on classic games and movies that flat out just aren't very good anymore. I just did it to GoldenEye after all. But I think even without a nostalgia hearing aid, Ocarina of Time's still a damn good game in 2018. Yeah, there's flaws and it's by no means perfect, but I find it hard to believe that somebody could play that game from beginning to end and not have a good time unless they're just trying to be edgy and get off on thinking that they're different for disliking something that a lot of people still love. The graphics look fine considering the hardware, the controls hold up well, the music's outstanding and has countless catchy songs, the bosses and puzzles have a lot of variety, the story's simple but still good and easy to follow as opposed to many games today that are convoluted and have me just pressing A until everybody shuts up. And even though I usually don't think nostalgia should be taken into consideration when determining whether or not a game's fun, and I stand by my statement of this game not needing nostalgia blinders to be good, but even if you don't like the game for what it is, you gotta give Nintendo some credit cause this is their first friggin' try at not only a 3D Zelda game, but really this is the first truly great 3D adventure game in general, at least that I know of anyway. So even though things did improve in later games, Nintendo didn't have any mistakes made by themselves or anybody else to know to avoid, so I'd say they did a pretty good job since it's still fun to play and doesn't require the internet at all to solve cryptic bullpoop. And the only reason I think people have been harsh on this game lately is because it was widely considered to be blasphemous to say anything negative about it at all for a long time, so people are just letting their small complaints that they bottled up for over a decade explode all at once. The next Zelda game Nintendo fans changed their mind on after this, though, was Majora's Mask. I initially bought this shortly after the 64 was over, and fun fact, I called Stone Cold Steve Austin a son of a what from the escalator in the mall I got this game at while he was signing autographs. But if I'm being honest, even I didn't like this game back then because the time limit gave me an anxiety attack, and most people felt the same way, which is a real shame. But after a while, I started wanting more Zelda and decided to give this game another try on the Wii because I was more open-minded to time limits in games thanks to Metal Gear Solid 2. And after I was finished, I decided that this was my favorite game in the series, at least until A Link Between Worlds anyway. But even though it's my second favorite Zelda game, I do understand why people were initially shunning it since, admittedly, I was one of them. However, when the game was re-released for the 3DS, everybody seemed to be excited for it. And I don't know when everybody changed their minds, but I'm glad we all did. But let's move on to Wind Waker, which pretty much everybody hated back in the day. No, seriously, so many people hated this game.
Giving the fanboys what they wanted, what they needed, what they desired, Nintendo skipped all that cel-shading crap and delivered the goods on Twilight Princess.
Sadly, about a decade ago, this kind of hate speech was commonplace, and even though it was wrong and disgusting, everybody just accepted it. Thankfully, though, the world's more progressive in 2018, and if anybody tried using this type of language today, Disney would fire them over it. To be honest though, after seeing the reveal of Wind Waker's cel-shaded style, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little surprised and confused for like 5 minutes since the original tech demo we were shown was of a more traditional Zelda. But after I rewatched the trailer 1,000 times, I got more and more excited at the idea of experiencing a completely new Zelda all for myself. It wasn't like Ocarina of Time where a lot of my experience came from watching people play the game, or at least playing with other people watching me. Wind Waker was my very first Zelda game that I experienced all on my own, and that I even bought with my own money. It was also the first game I ever pre-ordered, and I did so by borrowing money from people in the same mall I yelled at Stone Cold in, until I had $5 to put down on it to get the Ocarina of Time bonus disc that I still have to this day, along with my original Wind Waker as well. Then after I finally got to play the game, I was absolutely hooked. Despite how great of a time I had though, I literally didn't know one person who had anything positive to say about the game until I met Shane years later. I know it sold well and critics loved it, but the game still failed to meet Nintendo's expectations, and the average person refused to give it a chance cause this is from the era where Nintendo kids from the early 90s all wanted to be cool. And that meant you could only play M-rated games. People wanted to pretend Zelda was supposed to be Lord of the Rings or something epic when it's always just been about fun, exploration, and puzzle solving. And Wind Waker was all that, plus being epic in its own way. People who did like the game still complained about the sailing taking too long, but that was one of my favorite things about it. Traveling through the ocean with one of my favorite Zelda songs of all time was so relaxing and made me feel like I was on an adventure. And I'm probably the only person in the world who more often than not prefers not using the Swift Sail in Wind Waker HD. But even though I understand people being impatient about the long sails, I think people were dummies for dismissing this game based on the less realistic art style that still holds up way better in the long run compared to something more realistic. This close-mindedness of fans caused Nintendo to scrap Wind Waker's sequel to give us a super badass and cool, totally realistic Zelda game that's gonna be epic. Which happens to be the next game on this list, Twilight Princess, that fans initially loved, only to later complain that it made the series stale. Which I do agree with. with, since it just felt like Ocarina of Time on steroids. And yeah, that's still great, but definitely a step back compared to Wind Waker. But it must have been frustrating as hell for Nintendo to have people complain about Wind Waker for being too different, only to say that Twilight Princess felt too familiar about a year after it came out. Regardless though, Nintendo gave everybody their formulaic Zelda game just to prove that it's not what everybody actually wanted. And now that fans weren't asking for Ocarina of Time again, Nintendo gave us the next game fans would be fickle about, Skyward Sword. It got 10s across the board, and when this one guy at GameStop dared to give it a 7.5, he got pants multiple times a day for about a month. But then about 2 or 3 years later, it wasn't even okay for anybody to admit they liked the game anymore just because it had motion controls, which were totally unnecessary. And even though the game was a little too linear and the music was a big step back from the countless classic Koji Kondo themes, I still think the dungeons were the best in the series, and the game at least tried new things aside from the motion controls, even though it didn't quite reach the levels of greatness that Wind Waker did. I'm sure it'll be okay to like Skyward Sword eventually, and that the communities of fans living underground will be able to resurface. But at the moment, not too many people are hoping it gets an HD remake like we got with Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. When Wind Waker HD was announced, fans everywhere rejoiced, which left me genuinely confused as to when everybody changed their minds. But I was even more confused about the excitement for Twilight Princess HD, since people went from loving it to loving it again in a time span of less than 10 years. Which just goes to show how fickle the Zelda fanbase can be, I suppose. Even feelings on Breath of the Wild are starting to change already. Don't get me wrong, people still love it, but in 2017, if you even had one negative thing to say about Batuu, or even suggested that you prefer another game in the series, then you'd get beaten up in whatever parking lot you were closest to. Now in 2018 though, where everybody put at least 500 hours into the game, it's finally okay to say that rain only makes the game worse and that horses are more of a hassle than a convenience. I don't think people are ever going to completely hate this game at any point though, nor do I think they should, which is why it's not an official entry to the list. And that's a good thing, because the Zelda series needs a break from fans changing their minds all the time and confusing Nintendo as to what we actually want. But the thing that most Nintendo fans have changed their minds on more than anything else is... number 1. The GameCube. I know this list had 2 GameCube games already, but despite having an assload of games that people would sell their firstborn fathers for to play on the Switch today, there were a lot of jabronis who used to give this console a hard time. Sure, a lot of people loved it back in the day, but I sure as shit didn't know anyone who did at the time. And 20 million consoles doesn't accurately represent how great the GameCube really was. A lot of this console's shortcomings came from the fact that the PS2 was the cheapest DVD player on the market, and since people had a DVD player that could play good games, many people didn't feel like buying another gaming console. Back then, everybody just wanted to play GTA and pretend that it somehow made them more mature, and even suggesting to anybody that they play a cel-shaded Zelda game would result in your fellow classmates giving you an awful waffle. However, I loved the GameCube in high school, and even though I literally got made fun of for having one, I still felt bad for those who thought they were too cool for it, because they were missing out. And it's funny how many of those people who were making fun of me are now begging for HD remakes or eShop re-releases of some of these games that are somehow less childish now that everybody's older. And it's great that people finally respect the Cube, but this console sure as hell could have used the help in the early 2000s. Again though, the GameCube wasn't exactly a failure, and not everybody hated it back then, but it definitely didn't get the fair shake it deserved, despite having perhaps the best game lineup of any Nintendo console ever. I mean, Switch fans are fiending for games like Metroid Prime 4 and new Pikmin, among other things, but when you tell people that nobody cared when the GameCube had all those games, oftentimes even twice, everybody who was alive back then just kinda goes, oh, really? Huh, I guess it did. Maybe we should have paid attention to it, huh? Well, give us HD remakes of all those games now then. And in addition to a plethora of straight-up great games without gimmicks, the GameCube also innovated and perfected 3D gaming with a badass controller and even a friggin' handle. But for the reasons I mentioned earlier, not too many people cared until long after it was dead. However, whatever the reason may be for people changing their minds on the GameCube, I'm glad people are finally wanting to give this overlooked game library a second chance, and that everybody realizes what they've been missing out on or weren't alive for in the first place. Although, I still think it deserves more praise than it gets. What do you think, though? Was there anything I missed? Know of any non-Nintendo things people changed their minds on? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, I'll pin whatever I find most entertaining. Don't forget to like and share this video to help this channel grow. Thanks from the bottom of my ass to everybody who supports this channel on Patreon. And if you're one of the top-ranked humans in the world, then go ahead and prove it by pressing the subscribe button. My name's Cameron, and I'll see you next time.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty. Thank you for your support.